Good morning, everyone. I'm Dennis Murphy from Sustainable Silicon Valley, and we welcome you to our Wet Talk 11. First, I'll do just a couple of things about us. Sustainable Silicon Valley, as you can see, is a nonprofit think and do tank. We are focused on areas of water and air quality, mobility and regenerative communities in a increasingly decarbonized Bay Area, depending on everyone's electrical panel. Wet Talks, by the way, are sponsored by Cargill, and specifically the Cargill Land folks, and they've been a real good partner. You'll notice this QR code on a lot of slides coming up. We are kind of in the midst of QR code madness, so we're assigning all kinds of things. But this QR code, and if you want to take a picture of it or subsequent ones, this one takes you to our YouTube channel, which has the playlist for the past 10 Wet Talks. And so that's what this one's about. Here's another QR code. This will take you to Ed Hawkins' warming stripes. And basically, he's is the inventor of warming stripes, a professor at the University of Reading in England, and basically has done this as a world warming stripe and with a projection. And you can go top right for a very hot world, or we can go bottom right for a less hot world. And kind of that's what we're striving for. Might at this point be projected to go towards the middle, but it's kind of our choice. And it seems, well, you know, on a large scale, we really have to double down or triple down on a number of things to get in the lower right area. We've had an interesting winter. So these are pictures from a New York Times article out yesterday that around Corcoran in the Central Valley. And with a quote from Daniel Swain from Wet Talk 9, as a matter of fact, the QR code in the left corner is actually for San Joaquin Valley Water, SJV Water, a great news organization headed by Lois Henry that's been very busy. I sent a thing to Lois asking her where the Pulitzer Committee should send the award, but she's been too busy to answer. There's Lois now, and that's actually the QR code on the left is from last year's Waterpalooza, kind of an interview with her. And on the right is Wet Talk 9, and that was Daniel Swain talking about extreme weather and its impacts, atmospheric rivers, all the stuff we've been living with. That was from late last year. That has come to pass. We have a couple other events coming up. We're actually have a ton of events either coming up in the short term or planned. This one is the beginning of our road to Build-A-Palooza. Yes, we have another Palooza that is basically focused in the area of regenerative communities. So, you know, it's kind of sustainable communities, what it takes at the city and regional level to have, for instance, a good housing element and have other factors. We have about 10 buckets that we consider in terms of regenerative communities. So this first one is in Menlo Park. It's Regenerative Menlo. And it's coming up April 20th, and it is in person. And the QR code goes to registration for that. It's a free event. It's a kind of a cocktail hour event with small bites at 5:30, and the program starts at 6. We have some really good people lined up to speak, so that is coming up soon. That weekend is will also be down the road at Menlo Atherton High School for the Love Our Earth Festival, which is put on, as you see, by a big array of organizations. And the town of Atherton, I think, is heading this. And as you see, there's a green circle here where our kind of washed out logo is. But again, the QR code takes you to the registration for that, as well. A lot of different things going on in that 11 to 4 p.m. timeframe, including a lot of interesting food. And then we also have our biggie is Waterpalooza, and subhead water everywhere, because that's the way the winter's been. So early bird, the box office is open. Early bird stuff, that's May 17th and 18th. It's a little unusual format. The first day, May 17th, is going to be entirely online. The second day is going to be in person in the Menlo Park Center in Palo Alto. And that will be recorded and put on our YouTube channel at a later date. The QR code goes to the registration for that. So I will, you can take a picture, or I'm thinking now I will see about posting this deck full of QR codes for the curious out there. Lastly, we have another event the next week after that, May 23rd, called Air Quality and Sustainability Workshop. And this is it's a new event, and it's basically at the intersection of air quality and mobility, and involves just a number of topics around that particular area. And it's a inaugural event coming up. So let's get to the show. And so Professor Jay Lund has kindly agreed to put up with my cornball act and appear for Wet Talk 11, and has a lot to talk about. So he is the Vice Director for the Center of Watershed Sciences and a distinguished professor of Civil Environmental Engineering at, I didn't put this in here, at UC Davis. And so this QR code goes to his CV, which I'll warn you is 48 pages long. And it is pretty fascinating to read in terms of just, obviously most of that is on published articles. And in looking at different topics to talk about, so almost at every turn, Professor Lund wrote about it, 3 years ago, 4 years ago, 12 years ago. I mean, it's way beyond been there, done that. I mean, it generally, if it has to do with water in California, I think there's some, and if that were a crime, the fingerprints would give you away right away. So one other thing I wanted to mention, besides being an eminence actually in terms of water in California, he's also a benefactor. And so this article came up about Jay Lund and Jean Lund doing a major donation to the Center for Watershed Scientists. Sciences. So I just wanted to make note of that, because that was pretty amazing. And then you can read more about that. There's a QR code for it. With that, I give you Professor Lund, and feel free to take away the screen. Okay, we have a bit of a muting issue. There we go.
Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Okay. So I want to talk about water storage in California. We've had a problem with having a lot of storage capacity and having most of it be empty for most of the last 3 years, to a problem where we're worried that too much of our storage capacity is too full and having trouble filling up storage underground and in a few of the reservoirs, but not many of the reservoirs. It's been a good wet year. I want to start with a little bit of an overview about California water, since many of the people in the audience are sort of new to a systematic study of the subject. This cartoon is one of my favorites. This represents, I think, pretty well what most of the public knows about water and what most of the political leaders know about water. At some point, it fell out of the sky as precipitation, and then we see it again when we open up the taps at our home, and we don't really know much about what goes on in here. And I think this actually also applies to those of us that have maybe spent decades even working on water problems, that we know something about what's in the middle of this box, but there's an awful lot that goes on in that box in terms of technical details, as well as legal, regulatory, finance, everything, right? Demands. So even the most expert individuals have really a very incomplete knowledge of the whole system. And it's one of these wonderful cases where it sort of takes more than a village. I think it takes thousands or tens of thousands of people to run a water system like California's. But I think when we're advocating things, or when we're exploring solutions to things, we have to realize that even people that are tremendously experienced in this field don't know everything. And that certainly applies to me. I know enough to know how little I know quite often. This next slide is cumulative precipitation. Usually I show this for the Sacramento Basin, but this year has been so wet in the Tulare Basin that I thought I would show it. We are currently up around here. This could become the wettest year on record for the Tulare Basin. We've seen flooding down there. Certainly we'll probably see some more. But what I want to have you learn from this plot is that California has 2 seasons, really. I mean, those of us that come from back east are used to having 4 seasons. Well, California has 2 seasons, wet and dry. And so you can see a wet season that starts maybe October, November, and runs until about now, early April. And then after that, it's pretty flat. We don't have very many additional storms typically. And you'll see also from this that we have quite a lot of variability between years. We have some wet years and some dry years, and over quite a wide range. The more recent of these plots shows the daily values of precipitation for these gauges. And you can also see the difference between a wet year and a dry year is the size of a few storms. So this very wet year we've had this year, you can look at some of the sizes of these steps. They're really immense. Whereas if you look at the dry years, you have very short steps and not as many steps. And these are the atmospheric rivers for the most part. Another way to look at this variability between years is in statistics, they call it the coefficient of variation. So this is the annual coefficient of variation. This is a standard deviation divided by the average for annual precipitation for thousands of precipitation gauges across the US. I'm from Delaware over here on the right, just down the road from Joe Biden. And you can see it's very boring. One year looks pretty much like the next in terms of total precipitation. Whereas if you go out west, it tends to get more and more variable until you get to California. And you see we have an awful lot of variability in California, more than any other place in the country. So what I like to interpret this as, California has more flood years and drought years per average year than any other part of the country. If you go back east, where most of our federal leadership is from, it's pretty average. Whereas out here, we have mostly not average years. Those of you that know much about California water at all will recall that California has a big disparity in where water falls and where we want to use it. So this map on the left has the dark blue here is 20% of the surface area of California that produces 2/3 of all the runoff in the state. The lighter blue is the next 20% of the surface area of California that produces another 24% of all the runoff. So 40% of the surface area produces 90% of all the runoff. And then these red areas are 30% of the surface area that produce 0.1% of all the runoff in the state. So we have tremendous spatial variability in water availability, as well as seasonal and between year variability. And it's over an enormous area. So this is a map of Massachusetts to scale. So they talked about big water systems in Massachusetts taking water from the western part of the state to Boston. And that's just like that's a little water system here. This water availability, as we saw in some of the previous plots, tends to be in the wet season. And when we want most of the water for crops and for cities in the dry season. So we have this big mismatch between space and time of water availability and water demands. And so the map on the right shows the tremendous amount of infrastructure that we built to move that water in space and in time, both using groundwater and surface water storage. And you'll notice on this map, there's relatively little natural features. Since the topic here today is on storage, I thought it would be interesting to show a plot of the total storage capacity in the state. Groundwater has probably more than 140 million acre feet of storage capacity. We don't use all of that. We tend to use a bit of that seasonally to move water from the wet season to the dry season. And then we use quite a bit more to get through longer droughts. For surface water storage, we have about 42 million acre foot of storage capacity. Some of that's used for floods. A fair bit of it is used for seasonal storage. Some of it's used for hydropower. So we tend to use a little bit more reservoirs, a little bit more for the seasonal variability within a year from the wet season to the dry season. And we use several times more of that as drought storage. But most of our drought storage is actually groundwater. And then the third bar over here to the right, this is this total of all the proposed surface water construction projects, surface water reservoir construction projects. I think it totals about 4 million acre feet, something like that. So even if we built everything that people are proposing, it's not going to add a huge amount to the storage that we already have in California. Now, some of that storage, new storage, might well be worthwhile, but the idea that we're going to completely transform all of California's water problems by building new surface storage, I just don't think that's the case. So if you look at California's water infrastructure from the top down, you'll see that map again of the surface infrastructure, the canals, the reservoirs, things like that. But if you look at it from the aquifer up, which is where most of that storage is, it's down in aquifers, this is what it looks like. Huge aquifer storage in the Central Valley, lots of little storage all over the state, in the desert in Southern California, the coasts. But you get a very different view of California's water infrastructure looking from the bottom up, which is where most of the groundwater storage is, versus from the top down. It just is a little different perspective. People talk about storage a lot and how to operate it, how to get more out of it. I think it's important to sort of go back to the fundamentals of what does it take to make water storage work? First of all, you have to have water that's available to store. If you have a big reservoir and no water, it doesn't store water. So you can look at a really good example of that is the Colorado River. Those huge reservoirs that were built that were last filled in 1983 and have just been, we've been depleting those reservoirs for the last 40 years, for the most part. They don't have a water storage problem. They have a water supply problem, water availability problem. So that's the first thing you have to have. You have to have water to store at some water period that you're going to move to a drier period. The second thing you have in order to have effective water storage is a place to store the water, a place to put it. This could be a surface water reservoir or aquifer, someplace like that. Your basement, maybe, probably not. And then you have to be able to get the water from the place where it's available to the place you want to store it. So one of the big problems we have in California is we have huge amounts of empty storage capacity in groundwater basins in the Tulare Basin down south. And in almost every year, this year probably being a tremendous exception, we have almost all of our surface water that's available is not in the Tulare Basin. It's up north. So one of the reasons why we tend to have so much groundwater overdraft in the Tulare Basin is because there's very little water available down there. So they pump groundwater. And we have a tremendous problem getting water from the north to the south, across the Delta in particular. And then the fourth thing, which is usually less of a problem, is we have to have some ability to withdraw the water from the storage at the time that we want to use it and be able to convey it to the place that we want to use it. Okay. So if any one of these four conditions is not met, or if it's too expensive to acquire the water, to have a place to store it, to convey the water, or to withdraw the water, you're not likely to have storage occur very much. So I think that's just a sort of a fundamentals way to look at things. One of our biggest storage problems is the groundwater overdraft, particularly in the Tulare Basin. So this is a wonderful plot from Claudia Fonk's work, 2009, that shows how really for most of California, we're not having a lot of groundwater overdraft, but we have an awful lot of it in the Tulare Basin. And we have some overdraft in some small coastal aquifers as well. Another aspect of storage, particularly for groundwater, is water quality, although we certainly have water quality problems in storage in some areas, particularly a good example is the Silicon Valley, San Luis Reservoir. When it's drawn down quite a bit, it'll tend to have some problems with algae blooms in the lower part of the reservoir, and that can cause problems for the drinking water treatment plants downstream. But for groundwater, we have tremendous areas of California that have very high groundwater nitrate contamination and growing nitrate contamination. Essentially what we have is overlying most of this area is for decades and decades we've been applying lots of nitrogen fertilizer, which turns into nitrate. All the excess turns to nitrate, and then it sort of works its way down the water column until it reaches somebody's drinking water well, and then they have a nitrate contamination problem. And so these problems are going to become much more widespread in California. Another interesting aspect of California water, it's sort of indirectly related to storage aspects, is the Delta, Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta, where it's sort of the major hub of water movement in California, both naturally and artificially. And so if you want to move water from the wet areas to the dry areas, you're going to have to contend with the Delta one way or the other. And the Delta has lots of problems, sort of its local geology, its ecosystems, and its sort of economic stability as the islands subside. I can come back to this slide. He had some, Dennis had some questions for me that related to the Delta, so I thought I'd put a few of these in the slide deck. What I want to point out here is how much of the central part of the Delta is below sea level. So it's a little bit like the Dutch. You know, you've all seen the little Dutch boy with his finger in the dike. Well, the same geologic processes that caused those Dutch lands to be below sea level have caused many of our islands in the Delta to become quite deep below sea level. We have a lot of water problems in California. I've been really blessed for all these years to work on these problems, to study on them and teach on them. There's lots of solutions that people have. We're really blessed, I think, in California with having a very partly blessed to have a decentralized system where a lot of people can innovate locally. Well, one of the things you'll see, I think, is that there are really no silver bullet solutions. In casual conversation, you'll hear people say, well, if we only built more surface water storage, we would never have any water problems. If we only desalted more seawater, we'd never have any problems. If we only had cloud seeding, we would have more rain. All those things are not entirely true. There's really no silver bullet solutions unless you're willing to spend a tremendous amount of money on these systems. We kind of have to take advantage of the existing systems and build around them. We've done very well making incremental improvements. Usually every flood or drought brings some innovations. And we're really sort of moving to what I would call a portfolio approach, where we're managing not only the water supplies, but we're managing lots of different water supplies all together. So surface water, groundwater, aquifers, surface water storage, wastewater reuse, all those kinds of things. And we're managing the water demands. So we have water conservation, we have fallowing, we have water markets. And in many cases, these have become, these portfolios have involved many agencies, because maybe my water utility is paying some other irrigation district to store water underneath its lands so that I can pump that out and use that during dry years. And so we have a lot of really interesting and intricate agreements that are occurring between agencies and across sectors that have really provided a lot of very cost-effective improvements in California water over time. The hardest part, I think, is trying to organize and fund some of these problems so that they can be solved, and so that the accountability is there to solve them fairly efficiently. You know, again, this is sort of the whole big water system. California, more than most places, runs its water system on almost on a state, regional, and statewide scale. So all of these things are pretty extensive in how we're managing different elements of the portfolio and trying to make sure they all fit together in a reasonably successful way. This is just sort of a slide identifying, for a water supply problem, what are all the elements of this kind of portfolio. We have all sorts of different sources of water, different ways of moving water, different ways of storing water, different ways of treating water, different ways of operating the different parts of the system so that they work well together on the water supply side. Then on the demand side, we've found, you know, we're basically in a place where we will always have water scarcity in California. We will always have more people wanting water than there is water almost every year. And so we're going to have to manage demands as well. So agricultural water demands, urban water demands, ecosystem demands, recreation, etc. And then the third element of these big portfolios is really incentives to make all these different people work well together. So education, pricing, markets, shaming, all sorts of things that we use to help the people that are creating water demands, the people that are operating reservoirs, the people that are running irrigation districts and urban water systems and state projects and federal projects. How do they work well together? They have to have some kind of incentives to work well together. And that's part of the portfolio, I think, an important part that we often neglect. This is just an example from one of San Diego's plots that show how they've really diversified their portfolio over decades, really, and how they anticipate further diversifying those portfolios over time. These portfolios include both local and statewide kinds of activities over a wide range of kinds of activities. I like portfolios also because they give you a lot more flexibility when you're perturbed by floods and droughts and changes in regulations and all sorts of strange weather events. If you're not a one-trick pony in terms of water supply, then you can do a lot more things. This is an important slide, I think, in terms of water demands. So this is a plot of the cumulative irrigated area in California. This is from my dear colleague Josue Medellin at UC Merced, and it's for major crops. What's the cumulative number of jobs and revenues that come out of all these crops? Well, basically what this says is something like 85 to 90% of all the jobs and crop revenues come from about half of the irrigated area in California. It's not to say that the other half is not important, but it does say that there's room to accommodate considerable amounts of water scarcity economically. It's not that there will be no pain, but if you protect the more high value crops, which includes almonds and pistachios, as well as grapes and vegetables, you'll protect most of the agricultural rural economies. This is a pretty general shape for a curve in terms of, say, for urban areas. If you had to conserve in urban areas, half of the water in most urban areas in California or more is used for landscape irrigation, which has really relatively little economic value compared to the industries, the restaurants, the indoor water uses. So we actually have a fair bit of ability to manage our demands to go well with water shortages that we might see on the supply side. This is about the last slide I have before we get to questions. This is the Star Trek Borg here. Resistance is futile. So here's 10 things that are going to change in California water, no matter how much we dislike them. There's going to be flooding in parts of the Delta, some reductions in Delta diversions over time, I'm pretty sure. Less irrigated land in the southern Central Valley, that's 100% sure. Less urban water use, more reuse, more storm capture. Some native species will become unsustainable in the wild. Funding solutions will be mostly local and regional, not at the state level. Everybody wants state money, but there's really not very much state money compared to the needs. So we have to really raise most of the money locally and regionally. The state's leverage is going to be mostly regulatory, not funding. Nitrate groundwater contamination is inevitable for most of the agricultural parts of the state. Groundwater is going to be managed more tightly. It certainly is moving well in that direction. And then the last one, the salt and sink will largely be restored over coming decades. Just some sense of inevitability of change in California. Conclusions, statewide water system. We have a statewide water system with local governments and fairly fragmented regulations, very limited state and federal abilities, although more than in most states. Still something like 80% of all the money spent on water in California is local. Local governments are the most important. The complexity of this system gives us a lot more flexibility and possibilities for management and how we accommodate things like climate change and droughts and floods and all sorts of things. Integrated portfolios are the future. Nature and economics eventually prevail over indecision and existing law. And these problems are eternally changing. California's water problems have changed tremendously since the 1800s. They've changed tremendously even in the 1900s, and they're continuing to change now. And so we should expect things to change. It's a very dynamic place, California, in many ways, and certainly water is that way as well. And because I'm a professor, I will give you some suggested readings. That's the end of my little presentation.
Okay, well, great. Professor Lund, you brought up a number of things. Actually, the top of the list of suggested readings, The Dreamt Land by Mark Aricks is, as I mentioned before, to Professor Lund yesterday, I'm about 2/3 of the way through, and it's a fascinating book. And Mark Aricks is a really good writer too, so very enjoyable read. So actually some of these citations, the third one, The Myths of California Water, we'll get into in just a sec. But there's just a number of really good things here from this. And there were some questions about, if the slides will be posted and everything. So yeah, we will do that. We'll have a follow-up email to people that registered, and we'll have a site that will have this stuff. especially on the previous presentation with all those QR codes. We'll have that up too. Let's see.
One thing, question for the audience: what is this map of? Dennis, do you know what this map is of?
You know,
it's a water issue.
It's a water issue. Well, one thing, this map is not that issue. But one thing I always think about is the sense of people within a water area and their consciousness of that their water is imported. For instance, in the Bay Area, it's very common to hear people talk about, oh, we send all this water to LA. And while that's true, I mean, in a large, it's also true that about the same amount of water is imported to the Bay Area. So, there's perspectives are important. Now, but that's to say I'm kind of dodging because I'm a bit stumped by this.
So this I think illustrates the importance of the social geography of California for the management of water. This is the vote for the 1982 peripheral canal referendum ballot measure. You can see, so basically Northern California doesn't like Southern California when it comes to water. And that because most people are really not very analytical when they look at ballot measures. So I think that it's just pure cultural geography.
Yes. By the way, one thing Southern California has been very good at in the last so many years is storing water. I saw this thing, it might have been from the Metropolitan Water District, about with these recent storms, they had some kind of amazing number for water stored from the recent storms, like in the billions of acre feet.
Billions of acre feet. That's an awful lot.
Yeah, and I'll try to find a citation for that, but it was really an eye-opening figure.
Yeah, it is kind of interesting. So for groundwater storage, how much water is there underground in California? Now, if you go, thousands and thousands of feet deep, you will get numbers in the billions of acre feet. Now, some of that water is too saline to make use of. Some of it's so deep that you'd have to pump it. The energy cost of pumping it up would make it prohibitive. But in terms of actual accessible groundwater, it's probably on the order of 140 million acre feet.
Yeah, so as far as questions go, we had, well, there was coverage of a number of things. Well, I think it probably might be best just in terms of the overall, looking at the state map, looking at just it's a big subject anyway, but the delta, there's certainly awareness of the delta. You mentioned it, comparing it to Holland in terms of how much of the central delta landmass is below the kind of the water level, and but it'd be interesting to hear just a few words about the delta within the kind of whole California water system.
Yeah, if you want to break California's water system, I mean, one nice thing about this portfolio approach that most of the agencies, certainly the urban agencies, have taken, is they have a lot more flexibility than they used to have to accommodate droughts and all kinds of things, evolutions and climate and the like, and changes in demand. But probably one of the weakest parts structurally in California is the delta. So if you break the delta, you're interrupting the major flows of water from north to south and east to west in many ways. So I think that's, sort of from a water supply perspective, and also from an ecological perspective, because so many species migrate through the delta. The delta is a real structurally weak place in the system.
I did hear, and this gets into some of the questions about, it was like, why is the delta important? And, as the main natural kind of almost reservoir for runoff and water.
The delta is a really interesting place. It's a beautiful place in a lot of ways.
Mm-hmm.
It's important from a statewide perspective for its water supply implications, for its ecological importance, for all these migratory fish and birds that are naturally move through the system. It's important certainly locally, for the people that live there, for the agricultural and economic activities within the delta, the agriculture, the recreation. Again, they're local residents. There's several 100,000 people live in the delta, so in and around the delta. A lot of people, as a recreational opportunity, it's right in the middle of everything, so that's pretty useful.
The one other kind of adjacent to that is the YOLO bypass, which has been working a lot lately. And I just wondered if you could, just a few thoughts on the kind of Sacramento levees and the YOLO and the floodplains involved, with the YOLO bypass that we see from, the highway.
Yeah. So the YOLO bypass is really a brilliant piece of engineering that took us many decades to agree on back in the late 1800s to early 1900s. It's a very interesting story. And I guess I'd recommend the book by Robert Kelly, Battling the Inland Sea, on this. Another wonderfully written, brilliant book on the history of flood control in the Sacramento Valley. For many years in the 1800s, the levee districts on either side of the river were trying to raise their levees a little bit at a time to increase their flood protection, until people on one side realized their levees didn't always have to be higher than the people on the other side of the river. And they would take a boat and some sticks of dynamite, and so it was getting fairly violent at times. And it was eventually realized that the floods on the Sacramento Valley were so large you could not contain them within the river. I mean, certainly naturally, the whole Sacramento Valley and much of the San Joaquin Valley was basically an inland sea during substantial parts of the wet season. And so the strategy that came up in the early 1900s, late 1800s, was to build a flood bypass. So essentially build a new river for most of the flood water during floods on existing agricultural land. So much of the rice in the Sacramento Valley is within the bypass systems. And that becomes really the major river at times like we're seeing this year.
Yeah, I think there was mention of with the Daniel Swain webinar about the flood of 1862 and where you couldn't get across the Central Valley. You needed a boat, and same thing with Sacramento. And so something really, needs to be done there. And it is kind of amazing for this kind of protection they have, which is, well, it's not totally foolproof.
Well, I mean, California hydrologically is a land of extremes. We have to be prepared, or ready at least, to deal with very wet events and very dry events, sometimes within the same year. So we can have some very large storms that cause floods, and then not have any more storms the rest of the year and have a drought year. So we just have to be prepared for many extremes.
I think it's a good time too to plug the California Water Blog.
Oh yeah.
Because a lot of these thoughts, and actually you wrote a really good piece about, we could have droughts and kind of flood conditions at the same time. I mean, there were a lot of good insights in that piece and others.
Yeah, so more than a decade ago, a bunch of our colleagues at UC Davis got together, and people have been telling us we needed to write a blog, and so we decided we would start writing one, and basically it's a series of weekly essays. Almost every week we have an essay of some sort on some water issue, particularly for California. And it's not just a paragraph, it's not just a casual thought, it's really a little bit of an essay with some further readings on it. So it's a little bit scholarly, but we write it for a lay, sort of a wonky water audience, without equations.
Yeah, I'll make mention of that in the follow-up email to registrants, as well as pointing to some of this stuff. By the way, I did want to mention that in the chat, and it's great because it's time-stamped, but your puzzler about that map, we had 3 answers, correct answers from Stan Dirks, Amelia Luna, and Deidre Desjardins.
I noticed that. I was.
Yes, and so I just wanted to point that out. And we will, and so I'd like to throw in some questions. I mean, we have a ton, we have more questions than we have time for, but I wanted to prioritize people from the audience asking questions. And so there's in the Q&A, there's a question from Ann Schneider about kind of urban suburban water use in terms of economic value. And Ann is her perspective is from Millbrae. Urban forests provide a range of protections from heat islands to slowing traffic. All of these have a cost. So is valuation of urban suburban water use fair, in quotes, in terms of economic value?
I think people that live in urban and suburban areas are willing to pay a tremendous amount for the water that they use for landscaping. And so it's clearly being valued pretty dearly, especially in places like Millbrae, where the incomes are fairly decent. So for the most part, so I tend to think that urban areas are valuing water about right. I mean, compared to in the larger scheme of things, I can certainly quibble with different locations at different times, but people are willing to pay a lot of money for indoor water use to flush their toilets. They'll pay an infinite amount of water to have drinking water. And they'll pay a fair bit, although quite a bit less, to have trees and gardens and lawns even. We would like them to configure their lawns and their gardens and their landscaping so that it uses less water and still gives them the aesthetic values that they would like to have, like they're willing to pay for. I think that's really one of the major directions in urban water conservation now, is to try to reduce the water intensity of landscaping rather than doing away with landscaping entirely.
This also touches on a kind of an issue that runs through a lot of our stuff, and that is the valuation of multi-benefits. And that is, yes, I'm trying to finger somebody to come out with a great, piece on this and get a Nobel Prize in economics. So it's my constant call out there. But in terms of, like, say, the economics of municipal and regional state budgets, and how basically valuations and how things, and for instance how multi-benefits can be quantified, in terms of those comparative valuations in a budgetary decision.
It's a great question, and it's an eternal one in water projects. From the 1930s, people in the water professions have been looking at multiple benefit projects. Navigation, hydropower, water supply for cities, water supply for irrigation, recreation. In the distant past, some of those things were considered to be intangible, where you could not really quantify them, but over time we've gotten more comfortable quantifying some of them, certainly recreation. We have a tremendous problem, I think, still with coming up with some consensus on how much do we value environmental uses, and maybe it's very different between different environmental uses. So are we willing to pay the same amount for water for different bird species as well as different fish species? Given that there's a whole ecosystem and it's all mixed up, it's sometimes pretty complex. But it's an important question, and I think it always will be.
I'll try to keep things moving along. Question from Nikki Irvine, trying to figure out what to do on her property with a large garden. And she'd like to store a substantial amount of water in a cistern, 10 to 20,000 gallons. And was asking about considerations about underground versus above ground storage. Easier to site underground, would it affect below ground water movement?
Yeah, I don't think it'll affect too much below ground water movement. I was really impressed when I was traveling in the Middle East, in Jordan, which has a sort of a similar, only much drier climate. But it has a pronounced wet season and then a long dry season. That many of the houses had fairly large cisterns. They would capture as much water from the rain as they could, and put it in these cisterns, and that was the water they would use for making tea and things like that. But they would have cisterns of on the order of 200 cubic meters or something like that. It's just very large cisterns. I think our water supplies here are much more reliable than there. I mean, one of the other reasons why they have those large cisterns is because their urban water systems really only run about one day a week. And so they have additional large cisterns just to store up water from that one day to use the other days of the week. But we have much better drinking water systems.
We're keeping it underground. There's another question from Tom Cabot. Hello, Tom. And this is actually one that I've been thinking about too, is can we pump surface water underground? What are the limitations of doing so? Obviously, there's a cost for the pump energy.
Right. So we do have places in California where we pump surface water underground. We tend to, so the cheaper way to get water underground is with an infiltration basin. Basically you fallow some land on the surface, you build a little berm around it, and you fill it with water, and you let it seep into groundwater. But if you're in a part of California where land is very expensive, say in the urban areas, Bay Area, Southern California, then you might be interested in having a smaller piece of land with a well on it, where you're going to pump the water into the aquifer. And sometimes you will use that same pump, just turning around to pump water back out of the aquifer. So it's an aquifer storage and recovery kind of a approach. In coastal parts of Southern California, there are some areas where they, the value of urban land, coastal land in say Orange County is very, very high. So they have these recharge wells where they pump water into the aquifer, mostly to repel seawater.
Mm-hmm. A kind of follow-up question there. In terms of the infiltration, is there kind of soil engineering that goes on? I mean, I would think that if, for instance, there was a kind of a clay or hard pack area,
Sure. Yeah,
versus
geology is very important for groundwater, and for groundwater recharge and for groundwater pumping.
Yeah, because I haven't heard much, just even, kind of, well, somewhat casual reading about groundwater recharge. I haven't heard much detail, given to kind of say soil development or, towards that end. So, okay, a lot of questions here keep coming up. Ann Schneider again, and this was dated right around when you were asking that question. So she mentioned life experience per peripheral canal, talking about the drought of the late 70s. That was a time of bricks putting in toilets and things, extreme water conservation.
That's right.
And she was at UCLA, where every lawn in Beverly Hills was lush and green. So anyway, she said there were many reasons why that vote back then was the way it was. And I know just even we had inter-family dealings sometimes with people that would be at like Palo Verde's estates or something, and they didn't know there was a drought. It was a time of extreme drought, and they just didn't have a clue, and it didn't affect their lives at that. Now this is quite a while ago, and I think there's been much more awareness, but still.
Yeah, there's an interesting dilemma, I think, in the water area. People in the water field often say, well, it would really help if people knew where their water came from. And then you think about it, well, what parts of the world do people really know where their water comes from? They're all very poor places. So one of the hallmarks of a successful civilization is that most people don't know most of the time where their water came from. It allows us to think about other things and be much more prosperous. But we do want people to know a little bit, to think about water in a dry place like California, and use less water in a reasonable way. So it's a little bit of a dilemma for us.
Okay, moving along. Brownwin Barry, always thinking about buildings, has a question. How does the distribution of our urban developments affect our water future? Can increasing housing density help?
Oh, sure. Oh, gosh, yes. Spain, where most people live in apartments, has a per capita water use of about 120 to 130 liters per capita per day. So less than 1/4 of what we use in California in a very similar climate. So if you change your housing densities, and largely eliminate much of the outdoor irrigation, you can tremendously reduce our urban water use. Now, in California, urban water use is about 20% of all the human water use in the state. So, in terms of groundwater overdraft and environmental purposes, the main conflicts are not so much with urban as they are with agriculture. But people, the urban areas need to always try to conserve as well.
We've had at last year's Waterpalooza and a time since then, we've had some discussions and references to the net zero water movement in terms of new development. And I mean, it's kind of a plank within CEQA as far as the water assessment. And so there is some actually even on the peninsula in some of the cow water areas. I know they are thinking and actually doing things involving that kind of the assessment, like this development would not impact water demand overall.
Well, decades ago, the city of Morro Bay had a arrangement where they had very limited water supply, and you're only able to build new houses there if you implemented water conservation in existing houses enough to supply that new house with water. That turned out to be sort of an accounting nightmare, I expect, but there's lots of different ways to do things.
Just here's a different question from friend of SSV, Steve Jordan, about desal. And do you think California should get behind the Diablo desal proposal, which targets 500 to 1,000 KAF per year at a cost of about 1,000 to 1,200 acre feet?
Well, if you can get water for about $1,000 an acre feet or less, that's in Southern California, that's pretty attractive.
Yeah, this would be more central. I mean, Diablo Canyon. I think the thinking is Diablo Canyon is now extended. It's extended its lifetime, and so there is this base load energy, and so kind of what to do with it. One of the issues involved, and that's a whole other issue, and I've been talking actually to Steve about this topic regarding both, like beneficial uses of baseload power, granted that it's there for the sustainable future.
So there's if you can find really cheap energy, it makes desalination much more attractive. Be it brackish or seawater desalination. But I think what Poseidon is $2,500 an acre foot or something like that. That's pretty expensive water.
That's is that the Huntington Beach?
That's the one in San Diego.
Okay. Yeah, I would say that's
so yeah, but if you can get it down to $1,000 an acre foot, that's on the order of what people are looking at for wastewater reuse kinds of costs.
Yeah,
it's very interesting to see if they're supposed to have some regulations coming out, I think this year, on direct potable reuse. So for some parts of Southern California, we might see direct potable reuse coming in. That could be pretty attractive because you don't have to build a new redistribution system.
Yeah, we were talking, with about Millbrae, and actually in the peninsula, at least the northern half of San Mateo County, there are plans afoot for some major water reuse, water treatment under the a lot of partners, but under the umbrella of Silicon Valley Clean Water.
Right.
And that's a really ambitious plan, but they've they've finished all their other infrastructure plans, or at least are working on their I don't know, billions of dollars of upgrades, and so they've gotten a lot of experience on large projects. So I guess this is the next one they're pointing to. It won't be cheap water, but it'll be obviously available water and not subject to
Right, something you
disruption.
can control.
Yeah, so that is a big deal. So here's a question about Governor Newsom's talk about diverting meltwater to ag lands to recharge groundwater. Can we have many smaller ponds for slowing flood and recharge? And I also want to throw in, there was a decision that there was a San Joaquin Valley Water, a Lois Henry article about a budget cut for flood protection in disadvantaged communities. It's a $40 million program that got cut out of the budget. The timing obviously couldn't be worse, or let alone the optics. But anyway, I'll kind of state executive leadership on this.
Yeah, there's a lot of discussion at Department of Water Resources and in a lot of different environmental groups and some farmers about capturing floodwaters and infiltrating them to groundwater on fields. And I think that's a good idea. But there's been some really interesting studies that have looked at, going back to the slide that I had on the 4 things you have to have in order to make a water storage work. You have to have water, you have to have a place to put it, you have to have conveyance to get the water from where it is to the place you want to put it, and then you have to be able to get it back out and take it, deliver it to someplace that wants it.
So what's the percentage of state electricity that is used to push water over the grapevine?
It might be on the order of 1% or 2%. There's some folklore that says something like 23% of California electricity is used for water. It turns out that 3/4 of that is for heating water.
Mm-hmm.
Water is takes a lot of electricity and not natural gas to heat water. So having warm showers is most of that.
I would I'll throw out a shout out to heat pump water heaters.
Yeah. Okay.
Use your electricity, don't use your gas on heating water. Last I did model, it was years ago, but it was like more on 16% was the number bandied about for moving water around the state.
Yeah. Some of that will be for pumping groundwater. Some of it will be, keep pressurizing the water distribution systems. But,
yeah. So moving water up and sideways and, and
all over
over.
the place. Yeah, water's heavy stuff. Take a 5-gallon jug of water and carry it around for a little bit. You'll get a sense for how energy intensive it is to move it.
Okay, trying to keep things along. And by the way, we did have a whole thing about myth busting. And I hope we'll get to, I'm trying to move as quickly as possible, but if that will be yet another thing on that email linkage, because like so many other things, Dr. Lund worked on an article with a number of other esteemed colleagues on myth busting way back a few droughts ago. So anyway, there's a question from Julia Schmidt. Private companies wanting to help fund aquifer storage and recharge projects, mainly for ESG reasons. They want shovel-ready projects. And Julia is saying she sees a need for state to fund more planning work in the area to assist local governments, which talking about the cooperation thing, which is always interesting, and who may need more funds for planning as opposed to the actual design and construction. So anyway, thoughts about that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. The groups that I think have been tremendously effective at this aquifer storage and recovery and recharge have been irrigation districts, and we're going to see that happen even more with the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. We're going to see irrigation districts, which have traditionally seen themselves as surface water supply systems, also get more involved in groundwater management, but managing the pore space for storing groundwater underneath their irrigation districts. And those groups are pretty well organized. They're pretty entrepreneurial. They're pretty creative, especially if they see their neighbors being successful at it. So I'm not sure you're going to see a lot of investor firms coming in and trying to buy up groundwater basins and recharge facilities. I think the water rights side of that and all the transaction costs of getting people to agree on the contracts for people that own different parts of the system is not gonna, it's gonna be hard to do. You probably see some of it happen, but the irrigation districts and the farmer communities, they control a lot of land, they control a lot of empty pore space below them. They run their water systems on the surface. and they have a direct interest in making sure the thing works.
Yeah, it sounds like there would need to be some kind of creative, even legal structures involved in this. Moving along, SSV's own Lisa Kirby has a question, the inevitable AI question. Thoughts on how AI might be used to explore and quantify multiple benefits of water initiatives, assuming ChatGPT isn't just used for water utilities to put out press releases.
Well, I think we could see a new age in water management where EIRs and EISs and comments on EIRs and EISs are all generated by ChatGPT kind of software. A lot of people will become unemployed from that, I'm afraid. Yeah, we will see there's certainly a lot of data involved in water. Certainly on the urban scale, we collect a lot of data. So I think we'll see a lot of use of AI as we have in statistics to get some insights on how water management is working and can work better. So I don't think it'll be completely revolutionary, but I think it'll be nice.
Okay, let's see. Just moving through the questions. Ann Schneider has a follow-up. She's on the city council in Millbrae, talking about the Hetch Hetchy system costs and BOSCA, the 27 or 26 member user group with SFPUC water. And obviously cities within the Boscus group. I mean, you know, we certainly pay for the, well, it's not even so much we're paying for the water, we're paying for the new pipes that have been put in over the past few years. That was $6 billion, I think, to get decent, well, to replace the pipes from the Irvington district of Fremont to the peninsula. And
The Hetch Hetchy system was really a marvel when it was built in the late 1920s. And it was kind of so successful and so well built that San Francisco could largely neglect it for many decades. And then eventually you have to sort of rebuild it. So that, I think, is the need to rehabilitate Hetch Hetchy system was unavoidable after all those years. And that's certainly going to raise the cost as they pass those capital costs on to their service area. The question she raises in her chat question, I think, is really interesting about urban forests, and maybe they're over conserving in the sense that they have trees that they would like to keep, but they're dying because people are perhaps conserving too much water. So I think we should in California be thinking at the urban landscape scale, because the urban landscapes, that's where most of the people live. That's where most of the value is. That's where most of where we live. So we really need to think about, can we change our urban landscaping so that we get the aesthetic benefits and the sort of human benefits that we like to have in the urban areas where we all live, but maybe with less need for water, in terms of selecting the particular varieties of trees and the shape of the landscaping and the ability to maybe capture some of the water, stormwater, to supply those outdoor water uses.
Yes, and Ann Schneider, as well as we have a few Bosca members, board members who are on this. Steve Jordan was another from Los Altos Hills, I believe. Yeah, anyway, good question. Obviously, you know, when we start looking, and this is something that comes up in the Central Valley, you know, in terms of fruit, well, both citrus trees, but also nut trees, famously almonds and pomegranates, need a lot of water, and they are basically, you know, they need it all the time. It's not like you're taking out crops and planting crops. Right. And but in the urban setting, trees are a strategic asset for sure. And I mean, you know, just even look at well, the tree canopy is a huge issue in terms of urban heating, in terms of real estate prices. I mean, it's just, you know, has multi benefits.
People like trees.
And need to be protected, and that's a big deal. Quick question about Davis, which you probably know something about how Davis managed to mandate water collection on site and not have a stormwater collection system. The duality of
well, we have a stormwater collection system. We have some pretty big stormwater ponds in much of Davis. It varies a little bit from part of the town to different parts of town, but we do have a stormwater system, and we have some pretty large stormwater ponds where there is some infiltration, but
yeah,
manage this.
I mean, it's always been interesting to me about the treatment not including stormwater, and there's a number of historical reasons for that, and Proposition 213, I think, is the
218.
Which I believe even the Howard Jarvis people said had unintended consequences for stormwater, but then they didn't want to fix it. So, you know, so there's been this kind of dual system, except when, you know, it's a major flooding issue, and then it's all one system anyway. So, you know, that's something that hopefully can be addressed. I know in San Mateo County, there's been a lot of focus on the stormwater systems, as well.
So you can build an urban system that does not have much external stormwater system. So you can try to infiltrate as much water as you can on site. And in most years, you can probably make that work. Most storms, but you will find some larger storms that will overwhelm local infiltration. And you have to have larger regional stormwater ponds or something like that. Given the high variability, the wide range of storms that can occur, you have to be prepared to have your local infiltration capacity overwhelmed. But I think we should be doing as much as we can to increase that.
Okay, let's see. I am still working through. We're actually, I wanted to get to some of the questions. There's a question from Jerry Brown, who is somebody we'd like to talk to in future about the site's reservoir development. But he asked about Jeffrey Mount at PPIC, that the environment needs to have a dedicated water budget and a dedicated share of storage that can be flexibly managed through our changing climate.
I think that probably the biggest, given the very difficult climate that we have in California for water management, we have actually been pretty successful for human purposes. Ecosystems, we really have not been very successful. And so I think we really need to sort of fundamentally work that through. It's going to take us some decades to do that. You think of the several thousand years of human civilization, it's only been in the last 100 years or so, and even there, not in all the countries of the world, where we haven't been poisoning people. We no longer poison people with urban water supply systems. So it takes us a long time to figure these things out. Ecosystems are perhaps even more complex than human systems. So it's going to be really hard for us to figure out how to sustain native ecosystems. And we might well lose a few of them before we figure it out. The idea that Jeff often talks about of having a budget for ecosystems, water budget for ecosystems, I think is an interesting one. I don't think it's by itself is sufficient, however. I think you need to, it's nice in that it would provide more flexibility and provide a little better incentive structure for environmental water managers to think about more like a utility for the ecosystem than just a lobbying group. But I think we have a ways to go.
Esther Nigenda has a quick question. I'm kidding. On California water rights, do you think changing the system is doable, and would it help with demand? 25 words or less.
My biggest criticism of the California water rights system is that we don't systematically administer it well. We don't have a strong enough water accounting system to really make it work. I don't, people talk about, well, maybe we should get rid of the appropriative rights system, but pretty much anything that people can think of to replace it are no better than that system. So I think it's more about figuring out how we want to manage water for the environment and making the water rights system much more accountable. and much more administratively clear and workable.
Just to mention that the IPCC report has a great assessment of multi-benefits, says Bronwyn Barry, which I know I'll look at with that particular eye. Stan Dirks has, again, another quick question about the Delta conveyance. Yes or no? But anyway,
Yeah.
thoughts on Delta conveyance, the current.
I was really impressed when so when I was on the Delta Independent Science Board, we had to review that proposal. And I was impressed that for all of its expense, it didn't really provide that much more water. And really, the water it would provide was about the same as the reduction in water exports that they expect to happen with climate change. So I think it's going to be hard to make that work at a big scale. I tend to think in the long term, you're going to see some kind of a peripheral tunnel that might not be very large, might be about 3,000 CFS.
What's 3,000 CFS in basketballs?
Now, a basketball is about 1/4 of a cubic foot. So imagine 4 times that basketballs per second. But that
was a California water blog item.
Yeah. So we have a lot of fun with California water blog. We try to come up with ways of expressing units of water in consistent ways that people could understand, like basketballs for March Madness.
There was an April 1st posting as well, I think.
Yep. We've had some very successful April Fools posts. One of which had black plastic balls on top of Hetch Hetchy, covering Hetch Hetchy Reservoir. Some Photoshop activity was a lot of fun.
Well, actually, there's been some I don't know if they haven't been black, but there's been some things about balls over surface water.
Oh yeah.
So I mean, it was not far from the,
Yeah.
A couple other things. Some of these are statements rather than questions. Improved soil health increases water infiltration and water holding capacity. Cheer, cheer. And a note that pomegranates don't need so much water. Well, I guess it's a classic thing compared to what, I mean, for instance, almonds use a lot of water, famously.
So
pistachios use less than pomegranates, for instance. So
for all of the agricultural water in the state, which again is 80% of all the human water use, what are we trying to accomplish with that? We're really trying to accomplish making money for rural areas. And so what we should really be interested in is how much money do you make per acre foot of water in those rural areas? Not so much just the water use, because we're going to have to follow 1 million acres or more of agricultural land in California in the coming decades anyway, just to comply with the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act.
Just that brings up the kind of EDFs, well, the program now, which is settled law on fallowing, the I forget the name of it, where there's a fund for fallowing land for beneficial uses. I know it was a Assembly member Rivas had that bill. It was EDF did a lot of work on that, and I guess might be in its like second year.
That's gonna be a major change down in the San Joaquin Valley to follow on the order of 1 million acres of irrigated land. And it'll tend to be, the lands that will be retired will tend to be more saline, less productive, less profitable lands, but that's still, there'll be still some thousands of farm workers.
Yeah, certainly the case. I know one of our kind of favorite things we look at is agrivoltaics.
Sure.
That if you have land and you have like solar panels on them, that does actually create kind of shade for possibly for some crops, and especially if the panels are placed in the right way. And so there is a benefit for that, and apparently there's a benefit both for the crops and solar in terms of reducing even the heat on the land, as well. Also, I did have a question originally about the Turlock Irrigation District's project Nexus, where they have solar panels over their canals.
I would be surprised if that's economical.
You would be
I would
surprised.
tend to think that an irrigation district will have land where it's less expensive to build and maintain solar panels than over their canals, because for canals, you sometimes need to get into the canal to clear it out and maintain it. And so if you have solar panels on the top of it, then there's some additional cost and expense to move the panels and all the other things.
I wonder if it would have an
I tend to be a
effect.
little skeptical. I mean, it sounds like a cute idea, but I think it might not actually pencil out.
Yeah, I know they've prioritized it in India with some of their systems there. I also wonder if it had any, if it has any localized effect on evaporation.
It might. I tend to think that that's not a huge. I mean, it is some evaporation, but I tend to think it's not going to be, certainly if your system is at all efficient, it shouldn't be a huge amount.
I'll put you down as a poo-poo.
Yeah, probably.
And okay,
I don't think it'll make a big difference either way. I mean, it's not going to revolutionize things. It could be useful at the margins.
In the chat, there's a quote from Science Direct about limited water resources and restrictions for agriculture during a drought forces producers to invest in crops more suited to the potential future climate. Yeah, which would make a lot of sense, intuitive sense.
But again, if you're a farmer interested in making money, you're going to grow the crops that give you the most dollars per acre foot of water.
Yeah, well, I mean, California has always had their agriculture history has always been about kind of specialty crops and, growing what the market will pay for. I mean, a lot of it because, they were able to grow things you couldn't grow in Montana or Iowa or something, right? You have, so it's, always been about crops of various specialties, table grapes and citrus and as well. So
we have a lot of problems with rural poverty, but we have even more if we weren't growing those specialty crops.
One question I wanted to be sure to ask: where does the best tasting water come from?
So every once in a while, you'll see the American Water Works Association or other big professional groups at their national convention have all their, every water utility will send a representative and they'll all bring a jar of water, and then they have a taste test. And of course, every city thinks their water tastes better than everybody else's, but if you have a blind taste test, it's interesting to see if there's any consistency. But in some of those contests, like the city of New Orleans apparently once won one of these, which doesn't necessarily have really great raw water quality. But I know the city of San Francisco prides itself on its unfiltered system and very high raw water quality. Same with New York City. I once had a friend in Sweden who was from Sudan, and she maintained that the best water she ever tasted was straight out of the Nile River, which I thought was not anything I would want to drink. So
yeah,
still accounting for taste, I think, in water as well as other things.
Waterpalooza plug. Over 3 years ago, we were going to institute flights of water at our events. And this is in the context of advanced water treatment.
Yeah.
So, you know, they're like beer or wine. We would have little flights of water, starting with straight RO.
Right.
And which tastes terrible. Nobody really wants that.
Right.
But then it's more about almost micro doses of minerals.
Right.
And to get, you know, to polish the water and to get a pleasing taste. And I personally don't think there's been enough within even the water treatment world. I see a lot of perplexed expressions when I ask about the taste of water, which I mean is a fundamental thing.
It's so important. If you go talk to any local water utility, they are very attuned to, most of the time they get complaints from customers. A lot of the complaints that they will get from customers, well, this water doesn't seem to taste right. And some of that is based on what they're expecting it to taste like from past, but there's some people that are pretty sensitive to this stuff.
Oh, I think people are. I think generally the in terms of the engineering of and treatment of water isn't super attuned to that. You know, so anyway, we will have most likely we'll have water flights at Waterpalooza on the, obviously in the in-person part of it. We tried it over online. It didn't work very well. And actually there was a question Ann Schneider had, is can we flavor direct potable water? This is what we're talking about. It's a very it's a very low dose. I mean, but we had it all set up. We had we actually had a rocket scientist that has been interested in water filtration for years. He's actually the Twinvo, the king of koi ponds in the South Bay. He does a lot of filtering for koi ponds, and really has a lot of interesting ideas about the taste of water and its chemical flavor components. And so we'll be pushing that as well. I'm going to have last question. We were over time, actually. It's really, like all these wet talks, it's actually been very quick. But last question from Pam Riddlemeyer about housing density and basically an anti-growth argument that the municipal water supply cannot handle more residents, even though regionally, you know, it's a better approach. And so the question, I guess, is how could a city's water supply increase as housing density increases without building a reuse or desal facility? This is kind of the flip side of what we're talking about, the zero water approach, but also the fact is that the linkage between population and overall, well, per capita water usage is, well, it's been going down.
Per capita water use has been going down. This has posed some interesting financial problems for many water utilities across the country. But I think overall, it's probably a good thing. So in California, I think we're seeing overall the urban water use is going down because our population growth rates are very small or maybe even declining in many places. And then the per capita use rates are going down. So if those rates continue, eventually we will use zero water. And maybe, and if you extrapolate far enough, we'll have negative water. We'll be cities producing water statistically.
Well, we'll take that as the last word, a bold projection. And would really like to thank you, Dr. Lund, for hooking up here and on our Wednesday morning. And we will I'll work on the recording and we'll be putting that out along with a lot of other associated material, I think in a record amount of associated material that we have. And actually we'll reference some of the things like the water myths and
Right.
Anything else you'd like to point out to people
Well,
that
the water
attended
myths, I think is still, we did this in 2010. And I think it's still germane for most people. There are so many water myths. We had to pick 10 to keep it detainable, and we tried to pick them so that every different group would find that maybe 8 out of the 10 they completely agreed with, and then there'll be 1 or 2 that hit a little too close to home for any group in California water, and I think that's part of what made that a successful product. So everyone can feel challenged as well as gratified by reading that piece, I hope.
Yeah, so noted. I think actually you got it down to 8 water myths, but anyway, there's a lot of them out there. So we'll put a link to that that paper, which I can attest is still germane. Thanks once again.
Thank you very much. I
Been a
enjoyed the
fascinating
questions and
time.
discussion.
And take care.
Okay, thank you. Take care. Bye-bye.